Mamba mentality is often attributed to peak performance, pure discipline, and just straight obsession for a goal to achieve. Kobe Bryant, rest in peace, is not only the embodiment and the creator of what became the Mamba mentality, but studying his life and listening to how he operates from a day to day perspective has given me, as a student, the insight and the respect to fully embrace of Mamba mentality in my life and really diving deep into strategy, obsession, and the long game. Because what is the Mamba mentality at the end of the day? I think it just boils down to consistency and staying in the game and understanding that long game of what exactly is the goal that you're going for. So, goal, and what's the path that you're going to take to get there. And when you can marry these two things and you can use your obsession for your craft, then I truly don't think that there is any way that you can lose. I'm so excited to dive into this episode, this timeless podcast of Kobe Bryant and Jay Shetty. This was recorded right before Kobe passed away back in 2020. Rest in peace. And this just was a really great insight into the mind of the competitor that is Kobe Bryant, but not from a basketball perspective where you obviously they talk a lot about his playing career and his obsession with being great and striving for greatness. But it's really a look into his mentality that got him to the point to where he was at that specific time, and also how he then grew and pivoted from a career post basketball into a writer, a director, and winning Academy Awards for his Dear Basketball short film that he wrote, basically his love letter to the sport. But he really discusses in the conversation with Jay about how there's no right or wrong way to do it, but he talks a lot about self-negotiation. And he talks a lot about the idea of compounding his growth and what he just attributes to as getting better. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, get better. And yes, when you do that for a short period of time, you might see some minor improvements, but over a long period of time, when you really lower your time preference and you're starting at 1 and then next thing you know you're at 10, then the amount of growth that you'll see is going to be exponential. And he even quotes, I believe it's Bill Gates, of we underestimate what we can do in a decade and overestimate what we can do in a year. So if you inverse that and you start to think from a long-term perspective of what are the big goals that you have that might seem unattainable, then you can really begin to work backwards here of finding out what those steps are to then ultimately get into this growth like I talked about. And I think that that's just the epitome of Kobe. As you see his competitive nature on the court, you see how he was never scared to take the game-winning shot. But that's actually an interesting perspective because he dives into that not necessarily being the case. And I think it's so insightful on it, his framing through a lot of this in regard to how it like comes back to children and how he's building a lot of his business for children and a way that we can become a society that is actually uplifting children and providing them techniques and ways to actually succeed instead of just giving them the answers, because he understood that the winning doesn't come overnight. He understood that there is a deep long and rigorous journey that you have to take getting into that 10-year frame to become what would be considered successful and to achieve the goals that are worth and worthy of achieving. Like he talks about, yes, his playing career, he loves basketball, right? Like that was his big thing, but he also discussed how he liked to write, and he would write for different advertisements, and he enjoyed the writing and creative process of telling a story. And it was an interesting moment of him talking about with his daughter, rest in peace to her too, of how he was the confident guy who was the 5-time NBA champ and like 18 or 20-time All-Star, but he didn't want to become a writer because he was almost basically scared of failing. It was a fear of putting out his work and putting his name on the work. And she said to him, "Don't talk about it, be about it." And that was like a click moment for him, where it's like, oh, um, why is he having resistance to um, the putting out this work and being able to put himself in what's a very vulnerable position of exposing himself to a new audience and to a new type of critique that didn't come with his basketball game, because basketball, as he talks about, is like a very it's a very quick feedback loop, right? And something, when you're in business and when you're working in a creative type of endeavor, the feedback loop can take sometimes years. It can take even after your life, right? Like think about how many artists didn't have their work valued until they were already passed. So, yes, you can take that from a long-term perspective of using your patience as a strategy to have a idea of what you want it to look like over time. But then there is the just very real human nature of wanting feedback and wanting to put work out in a way that gets positive reception, because nobody's looking to really put their name behind something they're proud of and just get totally torn down. And it becomes a really deep human aspect of why we uh, are unwilling or unable to take some of those creative risks, even for something that we thoroughly enjoy doing, whether it's writing, drawing, acting, podcasting, whatever that it may be. You put your face and your name on it, it becomes uh, a very exposed position that people are naturally going to have thoughts and opinions on. And that's where it becomes like a really difficult game to play, because then you can start to like inhibit yourself from your true potential. And Kobe, he's talking with Jay about like a lot of the books that he's writing is specifically children's books, and they go into why he's writing them and how he's writing them and the different allegories and stories about it. That is really great stuff from the father perspective that he clearly takes very important, and family and helping kids grow. But he also talks about how creativity comes from structure. Like he has a very rigid schedule in his writing the books, and that allows him to be creative, right? So like the structure breeds creativity, and there's a saying that I like to come back to is oftentimes is creativity loves constraints. So creativity loves constraints, and when I first heard this saying or this phrase, I initially thought like, oh, when you have a problem, like if you're strapped for resources, if you don't have the money, then you need to get creative and come up with like a almost hacky type of solution. But there's a way that you can actually flip that upside down, to where it's when you have structure, it forces you to act in that moment. When you time block a very specific time of your day to write or to read or to research or to learn, then that just naturally allows ideas to bubble to the surface, and you actually get that creativity, that nuance, and that new like solution from a very structured sandbox, right? So like you're living in this sandbox of this is where I have to work today, and then ultimately the picture comes into focus, and you have that answer. And he talks about that. He says how he had ideas for, I believe it was the name of his ESPN show, Detail, how it just came to him because he was going over and over. And I think that's, a really big pattern that I've noticed throughout history, because he talked how he was just like doing something random. He was like going for a walk, like, or he was in the grocery store and it came to him. And there's just something about like those brief moments of boredom, but when you structure it out, so like you have like a scheduled walk throughout your day where you're just taking in nature, and there's something about that where, because you're on this routine, you're able to become present and really take in the moment, where then inspiration can strike. And once inspiration can strike, that's where creativity breeds, and that's where you're able to run with it. And then you have the structure and the systems in place to truly capitalize on it. And that's where he talks about like the cage is what lets him run. So when he has these walls built and this structure, this sandbox, right? He lets the ideas just soak and marinate, and that consistency, it breeds creativity, because you're just constantly putting yourself in a position. And there's a idea that a friend of mine had a few years ago. It was his New Year's resolution, and he called it his bad idea of the day, where every day he came up with a business idea. It was like something that was just again, creativity loves constraints, so he had to come up with an idea. So that forced him to just notice different problems, small problems, that he was then like, oh, here's a solution, and problem, solution, the bridge in between that is business, right? Like the P to S equals B. The middle here is the bridge that is B, right? Um, and it's so interesting, because going back to what I was saying before is like, when we are in that cycle of creativity and the arts, the feedback can often take a while, especially if you believe in it. And if you believe in it and nobody else does, right? Like if you believe that Bitcoin is the best monetary asset that is ever to exist, then you have some real conviction. I think over time I'll be right. Or maybe I have an idea for a book, or for a series, or for a podcast like I'm doing right now. And the feedback right now is not as concrete in a positive and up and to the right type manner that I might think that I deserve or think that I need in order to keep doing it. But that's not the point. I'm doing it because I enjoy it. I enjoy the practice of thinking through these types of situations and scenarios, and learning from these different entrepreneurs and athletes and authors throughout time on how they were able to build their success. And what's so unique about Kobe and this podcast in particular is he discusses how like sports is that really quick feedback loop. You have your stats that are measured in your game. You know if the shot goes in the second you let it go. You know if you won the second the buzzer goes. And that's what makes sports beautiful, because you can basically know like how you're supposed to feel based on the result. And of course that's oversimplification for sure, but in a sense, if you win, good. If you lose, bad. If you scored a lot of points, good. If you missed a lot of shots, bad. But that's not the same in regular normal life. And it becomes harder to see those feedback loops. You might get positive feedback, but what if the positive feedback you're looking for is not exactly what you want? So you have to learn to detach from a lot of the results. And that's what I appreciate so much about Kobe and what he talks about, is because he builds the walls and that structure, which then allows him to really just understand and appreciate the process. So when you appreciate the process, you can let ideas come in, right? And you can attack it. And then you can ultimately, from what he does, is create from truth. That's his biggest takeaway of, the sign off almost of the episode. But it's because from here, like, you're building on these two things and you have the walls in place to ultimately see this mountain being built for what becomes a full on piece of art. And I think that's where you start to really learn to love the process, and you start to see the forest through the trees of small wins that continue to stack and stack to where then, like up here, you have that exponential growth. And you look back, even a month ago, and all of the progress that you made from those parameters that you set up, it becomes uh, a truly unbelievable amount of progression that you can document and see in the moment. And that's where, when he talks about like his emotions and the overall process, like, he is very in tune with that. And he's understanding that he's nervous, and he's talking about taking like game-winning shots and how people get so consumed in their emotions. But one of the things that he was so good at was deconstructing these. So here, and I've talked about it before, and on this episode, he's talking specifically about fear, but he asks this really important follow-up question that I think a lot of us forget to, is like, what am I truly afraid of? What am I afraid of? What is oftentimes the question, what do I have to lose? And that can be a variety of things, but often the worst case scenario that we play in our head is not going to happen. And we refuse or ignore to believe an also best case scenario, right? Like, the best case scenario, it's just as likely as the worst case because it's probably going to be some sort of bell curve, you know? So you're probably going to be somewhere in the middle. So if you want to envision the worst, why don't you envision the best as well? And you can deconstruct to what you are afraid of. And then from there, you can make an actual plan. You can set up that structure to allow the creativity to flow, to have the organization to make the progressions. And based on what that fear is, you can start to accept and move past it. And there are practices that you can do to really get in tune with what you're thinking of and what you're fearing, and begin to notice like your response to fear. Do you run? Do you press? Do you shy away? And depending on that response, you can adjust and change accordingly. So the really like balance here is one, what are you trying to optimize for, and what are you suppressing, and if you are suppressing something, is that serving you, right? Because if you're running from it and you can't allow yourself to face it head on, then that initial small fear will just continue to fester and grow. And then if you're thinking from like a karmic perspective, you're letting that snowball just grow and grow and grow to the point where you won't have a choice other than to confront it. So if you confront it while it's still small, if you push through, then you'll have the opportunity to learn. And that's where the opposite comes in, where you can accept and interrogate, and you can use it as a data point, right? You can say, okay, this is something that I'm fearful of, or this is something that I'm unfamiliar of or don't know. So then you can study it, right? You can dive in, and I don't know why that got so thick. Uh, but you can dive in and you can start to learn how to approach these fears. And maybe you do need to kind of dive in further and take a step back and learn about it, right? But it hasn't become such an issue to where you are at a point where the loss that you perceived at the beginning is almost more real because you allowed it to just continue to fester and continue to compound. Because just like your growth can compound, the equal and opposite is true. Like that's Newton's law, right? So when you understand and you unpack the emotions, then you can understand what's real and what's fake, and start to you can start to view yourself from a outside perspective and really take the emotion out of it. And the emotion, which can be fear, it can be hubris, it can be humility, it can be ego, it can be the good, the bad, the ugly, all of these things. It just gives that uh it gives that sense of slowing down and really seeing a situation for what it is. So yes, I'm afraid. Now what am I going to do about it? How am I going to mitigate that? How am I going to alleviate that? And when that comes up again in the future, am I able to adjust, or will I have a different reaction? Because this is such a thing where in things like sports and when you have a team, you can fall and rely on others, but then sometimes it falls on ourselves. And I really liked how Kobe talked about the sport of tennis in that, and it's relating to one of his books that he was writing, of how tennis is just such an individual sport, and it's like a fast sport, right? Like it's not like golf, where it's kind of just you versus yourself and there's other people in the field, but it really, if it's just you control your own score, and that's kind of it. Whereas in tennis, it's one on one, mano a mano, um, and it's just the most microscopic, battle of sports feedback and mental toughness and the ability to really go down the hardest path of resistance, because you're trying to hit it past or through your opponent. They're doing the same. It's constant feedback. It's tiring. It's mentally exhausting, and there's no running away. And you have those conversations with yourself of, how am I going to respond to what is happening to me across the net? And that's why I have so much respect for tennis and the sport of tennis and tennis players, because it's one of, I think, the most mentally challenging sports in your mind, right, beyond just the physical exertion too. So you have like this exhaustion that is physical and mental, and you have to battle through that against your opponent. And it becomes like a challenge and a story of what the results are from a sporting perspective, because again, you have that really quick feedback loop. But then from an arts perspective and from a business perspective, you don't have the same constraints, right? So like when thinking about creativity and how creative can you get in basketball, like, of course, like there's a lot of constraints, but in business there aren't. In life there are no constraints, so the results don't really matter. It's what's figuring it out, because figuring it out leads to those results, right? Like there's a Jeff Bezos quote that I learned from, I think, the Alex Hormozy $100 million deals book, where he uses another sport analogy of baseball. The most runs you can score in a single at bat in baseball is four, right? You hit a grand slam, that's four runs in one swing. In business, it's unlimited. It is totally infinite. If you have a grand slam in business, that could mean so many different things. So the results really don't matter, because once you figure it out, then the results take care of itself. And that's where you learn to set up the structure and you learn to love the process, because then you have this bow that gets created and all the things come together for an ultimate win. So it just becomes in that conversation of what is the true result. Because as Kobe says, and he has a serious flex at this point in the podcast where he's like, the rings were expected when he won the NBA championship, but like the rings were the byproduct. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it's exactly what it's saying here. The results don't matter because he knew he put in the work, and he knew his teammates were putting in the work where he could rely on them to win the NBA championship 5 times over. But as adults and in the like real world, I think that's the same thing. What are the rings that we attribute to? Oftentimes it's things like money, it's things like fame, it's things like recognition. But is that the point? I would argue no. The point is the like real wealth that you're building, the relationships, the mental peace, the calm and the presence of the moment, the opportunity to do what you love. That's the point. And the ability and the privilege to constantly get better and to take in the feedback that, again, it might not seem like it's feedback, but maybe it's just a conversation that you had with a stranger passing in the street where you're able to detect this is how I should go about this issue, right? Or even what they talk about is a lot of the like business books that they read and a lot of the people that they like to follow from what they've learned. And this was a really insightful moment of the podcast where I resonated a lot around like the books that they like to read. And Kobe and Jay both talk about how when they were kids they didn't like reading, and I was and still sometimes fall into that same trap where I'm like, oh, I don't like to read. Like, I'd rather listen to a podcast. I'd rather do all these things. But there is so much knowledge in books, and there's so much knowledge in these resources that we have available to us at the tip of our fingers. And I had a teacher in high school, shout out Miss Weishar, where I told her, I was like, I don't like reading. I forget what the assigned book was. It was like my senior year or junior year of high school. And the assigned book was one of the classic, like assigned fiction novels, right? And I said to her, I was like, I didn't do the work. I didn't read it because I don't enjoy reading. And she looked at me dead in the eye and she said, it's not that you don't like reading, it's just that you're reading the wrong things. And that was, that was like just a one moment that I'll forever remember as a grade school student, because that triggered this curiosity in me here of, oh, there are topics that interest me. And maybe it was like at the start reading books about different like sport athletes and sports and teams and championship teams. But then that began to progress to reading about economics and reading about philosophy and adventure. And that just set me down a path of knowing that, okay, if I don't like reading something, it's not because I don't like reading. That's like there's so much knowledge out there and there's so much wisdom and stories that are so captivating. And when you're in deep into a great book and a great story, there's no better entertainment because it triggers your imagination in a way that Hollywood could only dream and that AI could only wish for. So once you follow that itch and you begin to scratch it, then you can really start to see what works for you. And what works for you will probably work for others, or at least others that you like to be around and like to associate with. So the outcomes are, again, those become a downstream result of doing the work, following the curiosity, and taking the chances of having that structure in place for repeated action. And repeated action ultimately becomes the process, which then in turn becomes the reward. The idea here that people love the process, it sounds so ridiculous on the surface, because you're like, no, 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 you like the 5 rings, dude. You like the fame. But that's Tom Brady will say the same thing. Like, Super Bowls aren't won on the field, they're won off the field. They're won in the off season. And you to strive to get to that level of excellence, you have to be obsessed and you have to love the process, because without it, then you're just going to be average and you're just going to be putting in the same, if not less, than your competition. So you're not going to be there's no reason to expect those type of rewards. So then you can't like to the process. I mean, I think that is where the whole idea around business particularly becomes so interesting, because you can kind of carve out your own league and your own niche and your own ideas and processes. And I mean, just kind of like continuing through Kobe's journey of what what he began to build through his learnings in sports and taking those into his production and his writing, is he's talking about, still, it's not about the rewards. It's not about the rewards, in that he doesn't care for the recognition. He just knows that what he's putting out is valuable from his lived experience and his truth of having to come up with creative solutions to problems, and how that's helped him carry that energy throughout his entire life to inspire them. And when you inspire someone else, he says that's more significant than any other championship. And inspiration is great, because inspiration can get somebody to take the first step. If inspiration's fleeting, and inspiration won't, get you over the finish line, but it might get you to start. Whether it's that first exercise, that first run, that first lift, that first hit publish, or that first hit post, or that first like recording and stepping behind a mic. It's challenging, and it's not easy, and there is a lot of fears, warranted and unwarranted, that people go through, myself included, to put it out and to try and create from a sense of authenticity and vulnerability, and exposing yourself to that, where it's not like I can point to one specific thing and that means that I'm successful. Like I can't just point to the win in the record column, because success is such a different definition for many different people. So he's talking here about how he wants his work to be long lasting and to leave a legacy. And that is just so important from his publishing and production that he created. So that was just, it was really cool getting inside the mind of like how he was able to use different allegories for sports and keeping sports fun, and some of the statistics of how kids are dropping out of sports because that's being a sign of sports not being fun. And sports are supposed to be fun. We're not supposed to take it way too seriously. I know that happened to me growing up in team sports. It just became to feel like it wasn't fun anymore, and I didn't want to play anymore. And that becomes a really noble mission that I hope people continue to press on today, because he's talking about how, again, like don't just talk about it, be about it, is like, go for it, take the risk, like don't just give answers, but try to provide solutions and ask questions and follow curiosity, because then you'll leave a lasting impact on, yes, the kids that he was coaching, but also others, people that are following, because you become a role model and you become an example that people can look to, and the journey becomes documented, and it just creates a sense of connection where it's not about trophies. It becomes truly just about the work, and it becomes about the confidence to speak up and share your ideas and thoughts in a structure that maybe people have never seen it before. And it allows you to create those connections and to connect these dots in a way that hopefully can leave more of a legacy in a sense that you're spreading ideas and practices that hasn't been thoroughly communicated in that way before. So just to final send off here, and this is like the last, like, basically sentence that Kobe says in the interview, where he simply says, create from truth. And that is the utmost important thing. And that truth becomes such a broad term of what we can define as truth and what is true to us and how we operate and how we act and what we believe in. And I think that that's important from like a risk-taking perspective of understanding, yes, the market will determine what is true, and there are different ideas and values that we can take with that. However, it's also so telling that in one of the rapid fire questions where Jay asks Kobe what his favorite book is, he talks about The Alchemist. And yes, that's a fiction novel, but that book also has so much truth in terms of like the hero's journey and in terms of risk taking and following one's personal legend, that I totally recommend the one of my favorite books of all time, The Alchemist, because I think everyone wants to see Santiago in their own story. And I think everybody can really benefit from understanding that The Alchemist is a story not only of self-discovery and of finding success, but also of what we have, not only in the moment, but even beyond the moment, is also enough. So when Kobe says create from truth, it does mean like from the truth within you, from the truth within. And I think that's a beautiful send off, because there is a lot of gaming the algorithm and gaming the system around things that aren't totally valued in the long term. But when you take some of these practices and you take these ideas and you view them from a low time preference perspective, then it becomes foundational to whatever you're building. And that is what's beautiful about the Mamba mentality and the way Kobe went about his work and the way that he shares his story in this podcast. So, yeah, I can't recommend this pod enough. It's a quick one. It's only 45 minutes long, but it's really it's a really like just deep dive into the mind of Kobe, not from a active athlete perspective, but from like I guess what ended up being near the end of his life perspective and where he was at in terms of what he was building and what he believed he was going to and could build. And I think that legacy continues to live on through just the Mamba mentality and through what Kobe Bryant really represented as a human. Cheers. Definitely give that pod a listen. I appreciate you listening here. If you have any other podcast recommendations, you can comment below, as well as like and subscribe, all that good stuff. Thank you so much, Aho, and we will be back next week with another episode diving into the timeless podcasts of our generation.